We begin now? Shall I just start saying hello?
Why don't we start with our introductions?
Okay.
That sounds
Hello.
great.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much for coming today. My name's Gargi Bhattacharyya, and I work in the Decolonising Arts Institute. And today's event, as you understand, is part of our public event series. We're very, very happy to come together to celebrate the publication of the special issue Decolonising the University and the Role of Linguistic Diversity, that's co-edited by my colleague Victoria Odeniyi. I think before I pass on to Victoria, I'm supposed to say a few housekeeping things. I hope you've already been warned as you come into the virtual room that we are recording this event for our own purposes and also people who can't attend on the day, and I hope that's all right with all participants. We're asking people to put their questions in the Q&A. As it's a webinar, we don't have the facility for you to ask the question directly verbally, but please do put questions in the Q&A, and I and other colleagues will be sifting them to speakers. I think we've also opened the chat so that the audience can speak to each other. I hope that's working. I can't actually see it on my screen. So if you're having problems with that, perhaps put it in the Q&A so that we can chase it up. The shape of the afternoon, as we're here for 2 hours, which for an online event, you need some structure. Is that we'll have in the first hour, we'll have a panel of speakers from the contributors to the special issue. There'll be 4 speeches of about 10 minutes each, and we hope there'll be 15 to 20 minutes at the end of that for people to ask questions or other issues to be taken on board. We'll have a break between 5 to 3 and 5 past 3, and then we'll have a second panel of reflections on what we've heard and on other matters arising from the special issue. And then we'll end with an open discussion and some closing remarks to be done by 4 p.m. As I've said, if there's any queries or things that are not working for you, please put them in the Q&A, because that's the avenue that reaches all of us on this side of the virtual space. And Victoria is going to introduce the wider project and the speakers.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Gargi. Yes, my name is Victoria Odeniyi, and I am a research fellow at the Decolonising Arts Institute and a colleague of Professor Gargi Bhattacharyya. The special issue of Decolonising the University and the Role of Linguistic Diversity stemmed from a desire to engage with debates and actions relating to the wider Decolonising the University project and initiatives. My colleagues and I, and in particular Dr. Gillian Lazar, who unfortunately can't be here today, were very mindful of the conflation of equality, diversity and inclusion and racial justice work within at least British universities, and with the contrast and the potential for a more radically envisioned decolonising agenda. We wanted to counter ahistorical thinking that has a tendency to forget the role of historical legacies in current educational inequalities. Also, and not always at the forefront of decolonising theory and practice, language use and languages are interwoven in complex ways with race, empire, and colonialism. This helped to create hierarchy between European and non-European languages in the past, continuing to the present. Today's attitudes towards the legitimacy of some languages for teaching, learning, and academic knowledge production have origins in the colonial project. Decolonial Subversions is a multilingual, multimodal, multidisciplinary, open access, yet still rigorously peer-reviewed online publishing platform, which seemed to be an excellent opportunity to explore some of these issues further. And we're very grateful to Dr. Romina Istrati and Dr. Monica Hermer for the opportunity to publish with them. I'd like to extend apologies from Dr. Karani Baroka, Gillian Lazar, Professor Suresh Kandagaraja and Erica Tan, who cannot be here today. But instead, we have invited speakers who will reflect on their work for the special issue, again, followed by discussants. So I'd now like to pass over to Dr. Noor Souleh, who will introduce her work. Noor Souleh is an early career researcher and a writer. Her doctoral research delved into the intricate constructions of othering evident in the interplay between lived experiences of refugees, international students in the UK, her autoethnographic creative nonfiction and stand-up comedy materials. Souleh's scholarly pursuits are centered around the examination of critical issues such as othering, discrimination, and identity negotiations, with particular emphasis on creative and decolonial research methodologies that contribute to bring nuanced understandings to these issues. Over to you, Noor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Victoria, for this introduction. Today, in my reflections on what I acquired and learned, and I wish to emphasize from what I've learned in writing and sharing in the special issue in Decolonial subversions, I want to focus more on writing the multiples and how that will improve our practices in higher education and diversify all the formats and languages in a more inclusive way. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you, Nora. So to start off with is the anecdote that triggered my pursuit, in a sense, for this presentation, which is taken from my ESOL classroom, where I work with refugees and asylum seekers as a language teacher. And because I'm a multilingual person, I was walking between the rows, and one of my students, when she heard me speaking different languages to different students, she told me, we have a proverb where I come from. It goes like this: if you speak one language, you are one person. If you speak two, you are two. Teacher, you speak more than one, you are 10 in one. And that made me reflect on what kind of person we can be, and we are, given the fact that we are looking at very diverse materials. We are surrounded by the world, and we experience it through our eyes. So I questioned myself, so how do I show these 10 multiples, these layers of me in my work and through my work, and as a practitioner as well? So I decided to think about through the different format that we may experience. So for me, my format will be a performance, stand-up comedy material, creative nonfiction, whether a poetry or a nonfictional piece. For someone else, it can be painting, or it can be a performance of contemporary dance or anything like that. So for me, these layers and these multiples can be expressed through different formats that we're more or less used to a very rigid academia that it needs to be a certain writing format, but there are other formats of research. And in my creative writings, whether non-fictional, poetry, or stand-up comedy ones, I always encourage the process of introspecting the self and our engagement with the others. By means of autoethnographic tools, you have, so autoethnography, we can argue back and forth about the different labels that autoethnography that may hold. Is creative nonfiction a piece of autoethnography? Can it be or not? So there are different views about what autoethnography can be. There is also the awareness of the conflicting narrative and stereotypes. And this particular point is very much related to humor, writing about stand-up comedy and using stand-up comedy, because there is this layer of stereotype that humor works around and tries to exaggerate, sometimes to draw laughs. So this point is much more, it is a continuation of our way of introspecting the self. There is another part of that influenced my practice in writing, whether comedically or in creative non-fictional pieces, is that the influence that books, global events, and mainstream media has on us as others to others. So for me, and I will revisit this, I'll give examples of books and global events and mainstream media in my practice. So last point is acknowledging the cyclical approach of producing a final product. So let's say it's a stand-up piece or a creative non-fictional piece. So there is a cyclical process that not many people are very fond of, is writing, reflecting, and then rewriting or writing some more and reflecting some more. So the end product that others see is not the start product or the meanwhile product that goes through it. There is a process, a long and cyclical one, to arrive at the end point that everyone sees. So next slide, please. Oh, there we are. So I'm going to introduce you to some parts of my practice where in this piece, it is the main text, how I've written it the first time. I wrote it in Arabic, and that was the only part in my thesis that was in Arabic. And I will read it in Arabic, but feel free to read it in English to yourselves. تغير الكثير منذ أن غادرتك يا وطني. مكتبة عمي بشير أغلقت. سمعت أنه قد وافته المنية. التقيت ابنه الوحيد نادر، وقد أصبح سائق سيارة أجرة، بعد أن كان يساعد أباه في إدارة المكتبة الصغيرة بركن الحي. لم يعرفني في البدء، لكن ما زالت ملامحه نفسها منذ أن كانت الفتيات تلاحقنه لوسامته. أظنه قد تزوج الآن. بسيارته لعب أطفال وبخنصره خاتم زواج. في بيتنا لم نعد نجتمع حول التلفاز كما أتذكر عندما كنت صغيرة في أولى ذكرياتي. رمضان حول طاولة يترأسها والدي. تلفاز يسرد أخبار العشرية السوداء، تتبعه تلاوة القرآن، يليه مسلسلات فكاهية، ثم أخبار عن أناس ربحوا مسابقات أعلم أن حظنا العثر لن يحققها لنا. أختنق وأنا أكتب هذه الكلمات، أدعي مشاهدة التلفاز وحدي، بينما أختاي تهتمان بدراستهن في غرفهن على كمبيوتراتهن. الكثير تغير وما زلت أحس أني أعيش بماضٍ قد مر وزال. This piece, as I mentioned earlier, it was the only part in my thesis where it was in Arabic. It is the themes of this piece, unfortunately, is really rather sad. It's a grief in the past, but it is in a way introspecting into myself, my feelings, as someone who is the other, who migrated, who is away from family. So these are all basically emotions that are very much relevant to the experience of sojourners and migrants and refugees whenever I spoke to them in my interviews as well. So for those who are familiar with my work and have managed to look at this special issue, so one of the main ideas that one of the narratives that I provided is about the hammam, what I titled the rot in the erotic. I mentioned this earlier before to friends as well. I said about the hammam, I never knew that the images about hammam are considered very erotic and sexualized until I arrived to the UK. To me, it's just a chore, a daily chore that I get on with it. So one of the, and I think one of the layers that brings this narratives about the hammam being an erotic space is what we are seeing in mainstream media, in arts surrounding us, in other parts of the world, writing about what Eastern hammam is. So Le Bain Turc, or Turkish bath by Ingres in 1863, what I see it is as a visual narrative of the master and slave, because most of the women are in a very confined place. They are there in a vulnerable state for the pleasure of their master. This is why you don't see male participants in these drawings. So this is one layer of that pushed me to write the narrative about me. But one thing that made me reflect about it is the book by Fatima Mernissi, Shahrazad Goes to West. And that book, in the way that Mernissi wrote about her own experiences as a Moroccan woman, is something that I've noticed in and made me think about my work as well. So the last piece is basically a part of my stand-up comedy routine, where I talk about the colonial and gender stereotypes that we are surrounded with. And it goes like this. One time I moved all my stuff, and in the process I dislocated my arm, and I had it fixed, and I had to wear something the whole time. And I went to the city center, and there was a shopkeeper in that small shop. And she asked me, "Oh dear, what happened to you?" And I decided, for the fun of it, to tell her my husband beat me up. And she said, "Oh my God, what a savage." And I said, "Wait, what? Christian beats Anastasia all the time in the bedroom, and all they say about him, he's a stud." So this is where I use, again, a book, and a mainstream media adapted it to 50 Shades of Grey, the series. And I use it to play on the colonial and the genderal stereotypes that surrounds me as an Algerian woman in the UK. As Frantz Fanon wrote about it, there is always that idea that of women from the East are inert, are submissive, and to the barbaric version of an Eastern man. And that is my awareness of the conflicting narratives and stereotypes that surround me that made me write this piece. I hope this helps you reflect on your own practices. And I see it as a way of a decolonial practice to write about all the layers that we come from and we experience in our positionality, and as a form of a reflexive practice as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noor. That was really interesting, and it's great that you have reflected so deeply and diversely and differently on your writing practices and creative practices. I'd now like to turn to our next speaker, Dr. Linda Ritchie from Johannesburg in South Africa. Linda is an English teacher, lecturer, and scholar with a particular focus and interest on investigating and implementing classroom practices that accommodate and validate South Africa's cultural diversity. Specifically, Linda is passionate about employing pedagogical practices that promote greater linguistic and cultural inclusion and equality in South African classrooms. Linda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Good afternoon, everybody, from a not so sunny South Africa today, but still warm. And it is lovely to be speaking to you from this side of the world. So the article that I wrote in the Subversions edition was titled Shakespeare and Translanguaging as Decolonial Pedagogy, Teaching a Transatlantic Julius Caesar. Before I go into that, I'd like to just, if we can change the slide, please, Nora, just to shine a spotlight for a little bit on the use of language in educational institutions in South Africa, particularly looking at the discrepancy between policy and practice. So the next slide will show you some of the changes, and they are admirable constitutional changes that have been made in South Africa since the abolishment of apartheid in 1994. So 2 years later, in 1996, the Constitution of South Africa in clause 29.2 stated that every individual has the right to be educated in the official language or languages of their choice at public educational institutions. So just to give you a little bit of background, as a result of colonialism in South Africa, all education was primarily in English, which had obviously come across with the British colonizers, as well as Afrikaans, which is a language that developed out of Dutch, and it became known as the African Dutch and is now known as Afrikaans. So despite the multilingualism in South Africa, schools were functioning in merely 2 languages, primarily English and some Afrikaans. But if you know anything about this beautiful multilingual, multicultural country in which I live, there are so many different languages that were not acknowledged in the classroom. So 1 year after that constitutional change was made, the South African Constitution recognized 11 official languages. That was in 1997. They are listed there on your screen in alphabetical order. So you'll see Afrikaans and English there at the top, and then a range of South African languages that are spoken here. You see Ndebele, isiXhosa, isiZulu, Sepedi, Sesotho, Setswana, Setswati, Tshivenda, and Xhosa. Now that looks great, doesn't it? It looks like South Africa is on the path to a good change, to creating linguistic equality in the classrooms. Can we please go to the next slide and let me show you the reality in the top 5 South African universities as of last year. So you will see them listed there. I do some research for the University of the Witwatersrand, the second university there. But notice what you'll see. English is the only medium of instruction in 4 of the 5 top South African universities, and only 1 South African university uses 2 languages. Again, they are only what I call the languages of the colonizers, and all the other indigenous South African languages are marginalized, silenced, not given a voice in the classroom. So there is a very disturbing discrepancy in South Africa. In education, I work in secondary and tertiary education, where what happens in the classroom does not represent the multilingualism of our beautiful land. So what I decided to do, if we look at the next slide, is to investigate an intervention that could potentially decolonize the teaching of Shakespeare. Now, I don't have enough time to give the background of that, but Shakespeare continues to be taught in South Africa regardless of, or despite, or in spite of all the links with the British colonizers. I had a couple of aims in my intervention, but for the purpose of today, I'm just going to focus on one. And the one aim was to investigate whether the decolonial intervention that I did could subvert the linguistic monopoly of the English language in the teaching and learning of Shakespeare. And I used translanguaging in that, which is a term that's been around for a good couple of decades now, first coined by Williams et al., and basically incorporates the use of 2 or more languages within a class. It's planned, it's deliberate for the purposes of both teaching and learning. My decolonial intervention in Shakespeare was positioned alongside a couple of other decolonial interventions in South Africa. Now I'm hoping on the next slide to show you a clip of a use of translanguaging in Shakespeare. So if we can try and play that clip, please, Nora. it was brought about during the lockdown here in South Africa, where artists, actors worked in their own homes. You can push play, thank you. And they recorded excerpts of Shakespeare. Hope it's going to play for you, because what it does is you will hear trans-languaging by the artist, or Abile Ditsele. He's playing the role of Macbeth, and you will hear him trans-language between English and Setswana. So for the interest of time, I won't wait too long, but hopefully we can just, I would love for you just to hear the movement between English and as South African language, because it just gives you a sense that there is work happening here in South Africa to decolonize.
Justice commands our own poison chalice to our own lips. Tshepo ya kgosi le tse fonna ka mabaka a mabedi. La ntlha ke tsala ya gagwe le modiri wa bokgosi. Ke ka moo ke tshwanetseng go mo sireletsa. Ya bobedi ke nna moamogedi wa gagwe ntlong ya me ke.
So just to give you a taste of some of the work that's being done here in South Africa, very exciting work in the theatre space. And I started to look, can we do it at a tertiary level? So this is what my study did. The methodology entailed a transatlantic digital exchange between second-year English students at UT, the University of Texas in America, and Wits University here in Johannesburg. We met a couple of times online. It took place in the first 6 months of 2022. It entailed chase or some of the things that are important to understand what I did. So on the next slide, you'll see that the students were divided, which was the group that they looked at the assassination of Julius Caesar, and they completely changed it from the original script of Shakespeare, and they explored societal threats in their own environments that they would like to see fall, just as they want to see Julius Caesar fall. And just to look at their use of language specifically for today, that's shown on the next slide, if we can go there, please. So what I did when I analyzed the videos of, next slide, please, of the three groups, I divided their use of language between Brutus and Caesar. If you know the play, they are the Roman politicians. And then I looked at the use of language of the plebeians, the working class citizens. And such an interesting thing was found. So when the students, and they were made up of American and Wits and South African students, racially very mixed, linguistically very mixed group of students. When they spoke in the words of Brutus and Caesar, in all the groups, they only used Shakespeare's early modern English and Latin, a very academic language. However, when they used and spoke as the common people, they used a range of languages, such an interesting range too. You can see it there: Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, which is a mixture of languages, Dutch, French, Hebrew, isiZulu, modern English, Sepedi, Sesotho, and Spanish. Here were some of the conclusions I drew, just to show you on the next screen. Just looking at, can we decolonize the teaching of Shakespeare? So if we can so here's some of the conclusions I drew based on what the students did. I concluded that their use of language reflects a linguistic power hierarchy that indicates British colonial notions of English, or in one instance, Latin, a language associated with academia, as appropriate languages for use by those in power. And very interestingly, whether it was conscious or not conscious, the perception that the languages of the working class people, the less powerful people, are somehow inferior and you can play with them a little bit more, you can alternate them. So very interesting. I didn't tell the students what I was looking for. I just asked them to take what they liked and to express it in their own languages, and they still adhered to colonial notions that people in power use the languages like English or languages of academia, but your more working class people, well, they can use a range of different languages. So interesting. And here's the final thoughts that I drew from it. If I can go to the next slide, please. I concluded, sorry, just go one back, please, that the decolonial pedagogical intervention was successful in subverting the exclusive use of English in the teaching of Shakespeare. So we did get that. But the students still subscribed in their language usage to colonial associations of English or languages of academia with those in power, and all other languages with those subjected to power. My final thoughts were that we need to keep going. We need to find a way where we can teach students Shakespeare if we have to have Shakespeare as a part of the curriculum at all. In the next slide, please. But still, to borrow the term by Mampane et al., we need to find a global solution where people can also interpret Shakespeare linguistically, and not just the working class people, but every character in their own languages. And my very last thought for just 30 seconds was to say what an honor and a privilege it was to write and to be part of Decolonial Subversions, to work under Victoria and Gillian, who were both professional but personal, guided me academically, cared for me as a person. It was an honor to work with such knowledgeable yet such gracious scholars. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was a fascinating presentation. I've heard you speak before, and it's always a pleasure. I think your classroom study around translanguaging and the focus on power relations and linguistic hierarchies is fascinating and really central to the kind of work that we're trying to do. Thank you so much. Shahina Parvin, Dr. Shahina Parvin is an associate professor in anthropology at Jahangirnagar University, Dhaka, Bangladesh. Currently, she's on leave and teaches at Brandon University in Canada. She completed a PhD in cultural, social, and political thought at the University of Lethbridge, and also a postdoctoral fellowship at Brandon University in Canada. She is interested in questions regarding racism, misogyny, ableism, biomedicine, knowledge, power, and regulation. Her recent publication includes Symposium on Anti-Racist and Anti-Colonial Theorizing in the Canadian Review of Sociology. Shahina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Hello, everybody. I hope you are doing well. So my native language is Bengali. So in Bengali, কেমন আছেন? আশা করি আপনারা ভালো আছেন. I would like to thank Victoria for editing this very important special issue and organizing this event, and also thank you, Nora, for all of your support for this event. So I would like to reflect a few key thoughts from my paper in my presentation. So in my presentation, in my paper, my encounter with the English language and my anti-colonial practices, I particularly focused on my own biography, and I unpacked the dominance of English language at the university education system in Canada and also in Bangladesh, where I am from, because it jeopardized multilingual speakers' learning, confidence, identity, and put them in odd situations. So why I focused on autobiographies. Autobiography is very important for feminist theory and also very important for women knowledge production. And as you might know, that women knowledge production is very decentering the Western ways of writing and reading the stories. And for a long time, women knowledge was actually absent in the Western-centric knowledge production. So my background is sociology. So in sociology, until 1970s, women representation or women knowledge was absent. So at that time, there is a call from sociologists and many feminists to deconstruct the Western ways of knowing and learning and producing knowledge, and how that can be happen, and that can be happen based on women knowledge or women everyday experiences, because everyday experience has the power to unpack or expose all the power relation is patriarchal and colonial power relation that often women experience. So my stories actually will give you the broader political system and also power relation that I experienced in Canada and also in Bangladesh. So biography, in a sense, I found decolonizing the dominance of the Western-centric research and writing method. So first, I would like to reflect on some thoughts from Bangladesh about the English dominance of the English language in Bangladesh. So the territory now known as Bangladesh was a part of British India. The colonial British government began imposing English on the local people after 1831, when the Crown renewed the function of the East India Company. So in 1833, the East India Company created policies of recruiting local people for the colonial government's civil service office to offset the administrative cost of the governing India. The Anglicist policy of using the medium of education in English in a school was developed in 1835 to facilitate education in English, jobs in new industries. British government's office, law, medicine, and teaching were obtained through the English medium of education, which in a sense created the division between the English urban elite class and also the subaltern people in that society. And that also made new urban elites and the ruling class and mediators between foreign rulers and the general population. So English became the way of accessing job, resources, power, and status. And when the direct colonization ended during 1947, but the trend continued and is still prevalent due to the globalization, neoliberalism, and multiculturalism. So as we know, white supremacy continues in today's society through the arrangement of transnational capitalism, neoliberalism, and multiculturalism. And in a neoliberal economic system, resource mobilization throughout the world and people's freedom and rights to access resources worldwide are encouraged. And proficiency in English become the vital to avail the opportunities. Within this spectrum, Bangladeshis became motivated to work on their English language and avail opportunities nationally and internationally. And I actually I'm worried that that might in a sense abolish the Bengali language in the future, because there is a tendency from many Bangladeshi people how to actually master their English language to access the resources that are available nationally and internationally. And also that if we talk about the education system in Bangladesh, that is also very much informed by the Western education system, and education from the abroad is very valued over national education system. And within this spectrum and within this process, actually, I also influenced or acted upon on this discourse of the progress. And I decided to pursue a higher degree, and I needed to submit an international language test score for my MA admission. So even though I was very critical about the colonization process, and I was very aware as an academic about the colonizing effect, othering effect of English language on me and the Western, I was very critical about the Western centric knowledge production. But this process is so strong that I even also internalized and decided to move to Canada. And when I sat for IELTS exam, I found that the statistics are very actually ableist, as the test takers require a high reading, writing, and listening speed if they aim to get the expected and higher score. And all the contents except speaking are basically informed by the Euro-American culture and education practice, and idealizing the Western ways of reading, listening, writing, and ultimately fostering the Western worldviews. But we are not actually critical about the system, because this becomes so normalized, and Western power and the dominance of English language becomes so normalized that we often actually act upon this. So now I would like to share some thoughts on the dominance of the English language in Canadian context. So as you might know, representation of Canada continue to portray this settler colonial state as benevolent and celebrated for its multiculturalism, even though it has a long history of colonizing indigenous people and racializing indigenous people, and the land stolen history from the indigenous people. So multiculturalism actually helped Canada to hide that abusive history, colonizing history. So multiculturalism officially developed in Canada through the 1970s and 1980s. So Pierre Elliott Trudeau official policy of multiculturalism facilitated a rapid influx of immigrants from the global south in Canada. And still in Quebec, the old English-French rivalry was intensified during that time. And in this spectrum, the declaration of multiculturalism assisted in muting Francophone state formation aspiration as a strategy of coping with non-European immigrants. And the inclusion of multiculturalism also aided in sidelining Indigenous peoples' movement of their land claims, while facilitating the nationhood of Canada with its hegemonic Anglo-Canadian national culture. So my lived experience in Canada as a multilingual experience as an international student primarily, and then a worker actually, told me the dominance of English language in education system, even though it claims that it actually provides services to the multilingual speaker, and it is a very multicultural society. But I didn't find that the service that multilingual speaker as a student, as an academic or worker need is present in education system and in the workplace. So I can share one of my example, like I had the best education result in my country, but when I moved in Canada, I often heard comments on my English writing. And writing culture is very much developed by the Western civilization and enlightenment. It's very much related with that. So writing is many scholars, particularly indigenous scholar, mentioned that is very intimidating for the other. And also Western-centric writing is very intimidating for the multilingual speaker. But in Canadian education system, you need to actually master the writing system and also mimic the accent of the Anglo-Canadian culture are English linguists. And that is actually problematic because it, in a sense, discard the other ways of speaking and learning. And when I often heard about the comments of my writing that go to the writing centers and get help from them, but there isn't any service that's solely dedicated for the international students and the multilingual speaker. So I was, in a sense, responsible to take care of my flawed English language. And that actually led me to self-blame regarding my language and my deficit, and individual responsibility to navigate this process occurred actually within the broader neoliberal and colorblind education system that perpetuated racism by ignoring my needs. So this experience primarily caused me to doubt my academic ability. I developed a double consciousness that I began to see and evaluate my strength through the eyes of white language and structure, which created a threat to my self-evaluation and caused my emotional challenges. All this is a part of the historical devaluation of different languages and the speaker of the other language. Thus, in my paper, I invited privileged white English and also multilingual speakers to reflect on this political aspect of the dominance of the English language that is very much connected with the expansion of the white supremacy. And I also invited the speaker to reflect on how white supremacy has created the enduring structure of inequality, and to act and make decisions to unsettle colonial structure. And we must be a part of making common platform for diverse cross-cultural people, where people can sacrifice a space for each other, accept marginalized knowledge, language, and practices, and disrupt discriminatory structures. So this is the end of my discussion or presentation. If you have any question, I'm happy to answer your question or any thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahina. That was really interesting. It's a very powerful piece that's included in the special issue. I was particularly interested in your critique of the international English language testing system and the experiences that you went through as an international scholar and as an international student. Thank you so much. Because of time, we have a few minutes remaining. What I would like to do now is just to share some reflections briefly on the final afterword that became an epistolary conversation between Gillian Azar, Suresh Kanagaraja, and myself. I recalled attending a talk many years ago at the University of Hertfordshire in England in January 2007, where Suresh Kanagaraja spoke about academic writing, multilingualism, and the coloniality of language. And I more recently learned about the Consortium for the Democratization of Academic Publishing and Knowledge Production that Suresh initiated much more recently. There were three questions. If we could move to the next slide. I'm not sure if I can do that myself. Thank you. There were three questions that emerged from the online interview and conversation between the three of us. The first question that I reflected on during the process of producing the special issue and the editorial challenges and conundrums and learning experiences was, in what ways, if at all, I posed, do you think that it's possible to decolonize universities without tackling the dominance of English? And I think that Shahina's just spoken about that. Perhaps a an interesting theme or a relevant theme that's emerged relating to that question is that the dominance of English or any other language, reified or not, cannot be considered in isolation or as separate issues from ontological issues or issues of knowledge construction. There are questions around which language or languages can be used in instruction, teaching, research, but we perhaps also need to continue to challenge and consider our own orientations and attitudes towards particular languages. The second question, I think also relating to the decentering of language and of knowledge, if we could move forward, relates to, the second question relates to the relationship that universities from the global north have with other parts of the world. How is it possible for universities from the global north to enter into dialogue about language and linguistic diversity and decolonizing with other universities from the global south without igniting extractive relationships? And I know that this notion of appropriation and extraction is particularly an issue that's considered and reflected upon. And how can we avoid that? I think one issue that emerged is the freeing up and making available of resources, material resources, access to high quality peer reviewed journals, but also the giving up of time for editing, providing opportunities to become a critical friend, helping colleagues to interpret peer reviewers' comments and so on. They shouldn't perhaps be taken lightly, but I think that some of the ways in which we can give our time for free, if we consider that we are from the global north or in a more privileged position, perhaps helps the decentering of knowledge production. This also relates to what we can do. And then the final question that I would like to end with today: what can or do you allow or encourage in order to diversify academic knowledge production? So in the final interview and conversation that I had, we were concerned with not so much pedagogic intervention or teaching that we've heard about today, but more concerned with the diversification of academic knowledge production and publication practices specifically. And I think that the perhaps message or the lesson that I learned through the process was the opportunities or the creation of opportunities to resist normative conventions from within the system. Perhaps going too fast, pushing too much may result in work being rejected, not being accepted. I think one example of the way in which we enacted this during the editorial process for the special issue was to allow different style conventions. So you may notice that some of the publications have no formal referencing and citation practices. Some follow the APA style common to science and social science in particular, and other publications draw on the Chicago publishing APA style common to humanities and arts. These public conventions and norms of conventions are not neutral and can be respected. I think a final question for us to think about before we break is, what can we give up? Are we willing to give up our power and our privilege, some of our creativity, perhaps material resources in the process and as we engage in decolonization of the university and academic knowledge? And I think the aim is that the support and the offer and the changes that we enact all need to take place really from a safe distance so that we avoid appropriation. Thank you for listening so far. We've had some wonderful speakers. We'll take a short break now and we will return in perhaps 6 minutes. So if we can just have about a 5 or 6 minute break, and then we'll convene at 6 minutes past 3. That's UK British summertime. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. We're now at the time in the event and celebration of the special issue of Decolonial Subversions, where we pass over to our discussants who will reflect on the talks in relation to their own practice. So first of all, I'd like to pass over to Professor Constant Leung, who is a Professor of Educational Linguistics from King's College, London. And I believe that Constant can speak but cannot be seen today. So welcome, Constant.
Thank you, Victoria. Yeah, I'm afraid my my camera isn't working today, so I shall remain, as it were, invisible for the next few minutes. And thank you very much, Victoria, and all your colleagues who organized this session, and also the speakers. What a fascinating and rich set of narratives, really, about, you know, what's going on in relation to this idea of some kind of power differential, certainly in education, but that in itself is a kind of reflection of wider social relations in our time. Now, for me, as you know, as an educational linguist, my interest, of course, in all of this is what is language doing, particularly in relation to education. And for me, language has a kind of double value. One is a means for expression, that is, we make meaning through language. But it is also an embodiment of cultural values, past, present, and also is a kind of space for struggle for the future. So whenever we argue, for example, the meaning of a particular term, we are really looking to the future as to what may actually be legitimized, you know, in our opinions. So language itself is a locale for our attention. And for me, then, there are perhaps, in relation to what I've heard today, two ways of thinking about the issues. One is in the, if you like, in the traditional, certainly in the sort of English speaking, but I would imagine in any nation state where there's a predominant language, is the, if you like, the predominant language that is doing a lot of the work in education. And so if I may restrict myself to the English-speaking communities in the world, there is one way of thinking about English, and that is the version that we tend to know, take for granted in a kind of common sense way. And that version tends to be monolingual, monolingually in English, that is. And English here is not just grammar and vocabulary. Of course, those are very important aspects of English, but there are other bits to English. In the kind of, you know, in the tray of the linguists, we refer to those as pragmatics and semantics. But in fact, what we're talking about here is a kind of, as it were, repository for cultural values that grant us the right to say something in a way that would be acceptable, and also grant us the right to say, well, certain things are not acceptable, so therefore not sayable. In other words, we are talking about cultural preferences. And so these, if you like, sayable things, doable things, tend to be unnoticed because they're accepted as normal. And things that are not acceptable, not sayable, tend to be outlandish, and they are subject to some kind of sanction. And here we touch off, you know, some of the things, for example, Shahina was talking about in relation to the international exam system, whereby the notion of English is a particular version of English. My work in the last 2 or 3 years has been focused on this quite a bit. And in my, you know, in my kind of, if you like, examination of the notion of English, I have sort of come to learn, if you like, through my own kind of study, that the version of English in the big language tests in the world tend to be a particular version of sort of middle class, educated, professional sort of English used in North America, whereby we are talking about workers, knowledge workers, working in offices, working with colleagues, or engage in a service encounter and so on. So it's a kind of polite language. It actually doesn't cover the whole range of language. So for example, in all my years of teaching, I've never actually come across a piece of language in these big, if you like, textbooks and so on, that would deal with language of aggression, like language for fighting, or language of intimacy. In other words, how do you learn to speak to, your partner, your members of your family and so on. So if I put it like that, then you see that, the sort of standard English that we're talking about, that Shahina and in fact, Linda also referred to, is that sort of version of English that's very limited, okay? So in many ways, then, we are talking about language itself, as we understand it, is a commodity that has been packaged, marketed to us for a long, long time, and we have come to accept that version as kind of normal, acceptable, agreeable, and so on. But within that, there are lots and lots of things that that need to be unpacked. So, for example, when Noor talked about, for example, the reference to the Algerian woman, and there are some kind of semantic notions attached to that, well, that's clearly part of the cultural package that you look at, and when you use the word, Algeria or Algerian and women, you then have this kind of built up of an image and a set of values. It's what really, I think, in the long run, what Edward Said used to refer to as Orientalism. In other words, the English language repertoire, if you like, does carry certain delimitations, and they steer us into particular ways of understanding. So any kind of decolonizing would have to be to make us reflexive about what it is that we are doing with the language and what we take meaning to be. So that's really interesting. Moving quickly to the more positive side of language. Well, if language is the medium of instruction or medium of communication, then all it is a means of mediating meaning. And if that's the case, then we are free to actually engage in using the means of this kind of mediation in any way we like. And if that's the case, it becomes obvious that if meaning making is at the heart of what we are trying to do with language in university, in society, in school, and so on and so on, then clearly there shouldn't be any delimitation to a kind of monolingual version of the language. And in that sense, this also connects with Linda's example of the multiple languages used by some of the participants in her study, when they refer to the participants using a variety of languages in association with the if you like, the less powerful, the plebs, if you like, and when it's about the the powerful, then they use English or Latin. Well, that actually in itself is a good reflection of the kind of values that we have now imbued in a way we think about language and languages. But it's also the window into the future, and that we actually can see through the mediation, through the use of language, we can actually free ourselves from that. And increasingly, we know that certainly in the way that we produce and reproduce language as artifacts, the technological affordance is there for us now to deploy any mode of language expression, in terms of graphics, in terms of visuals, but also in terms of languages. Acting, as I was as an editor recently, I posed a question to the publishing companies as to, how far can we use other languages in our publications? Are there technological, production problems with using, different languages? The answer was there is no limit to any kind of reproduction of at least written language now. So interestingly, we've got the technology, we should make use of it. And also, I mean, right through the different talks today, we also have this idea of, well, we also ought to be using different formats, injecting different, if you like, forms of representation. Absolutely. Different languages, multilingualism really is the starting point. But actually, why don't we think about some of the strictures that we've been working under for a long, long time? We tend to think of genre as a kind of like a particular kind of way of doing things with language in a particular way. Well, there's no reason why we shouldn't be thinking about using poetry as a way of expressing meaning or, part of the rhetoric to argue for a particular point of view, but in a paper that is built on systematic investigation. In other words, scientific empirical studies can actually mix with poetry. The point is, it depends on what we're doing with the language and why we are saying certain things as we do. So anyway, on that note, I'll stop, and to thank you all the speakers for very inspiring talks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constance. Always insightful. I'd now like to pass on to Danielle Tran, Dr. Danielle Tran, Director of Education and reader. And Danielle has published a recent book called Decolonizing University Teaching and Learning, an entry model for grappling with complexities, published in 2021. Over to you, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And thank you and congratulations to all speakers and everyone involved today and who played a part in the Decolonial Subversion Special Issue 2023 as well. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for creating the space. If it's all right, I'll sort of respond to each of the speakers' wonderful presentations and sort of wrap up with some general reflections at the end as well. And I'll do my best to keep to time. I'm mindful that it's already 3:19 there, so I'll do my best. Thank you to Dr. Noor Saleh for the it was so fantastic, and I really enjoyed hearing you begin with the anecdote of you are 10 in 1, and the associated points that you raised in relation to that anecdote, including how languages play a role in who we are, but also who we can become, which for me just beautifully signals to an ongoing internal journey that a person can experience that brings together languages and identity, and the extent to which we can lean into this space that may impact on the different ways in which we connect with our own languages, our own histories, as well as those of others as well, to bring about new ways of engaging and understanding ourselves and one another. And it was really inspiring and refreshing to hear and read about your personal style of writing as well, and the juxtaposition between comedy and subject matter through your storytelling. And it becomes a powerful way of pivoting power dynamics and perspectives and using humour. And in your paper, creative non-fiction and stand-up comedy as alternative forms of decolonial scholarship, which is in the special issue, also makes reference to the Algerian National War for Independence. And you note there that, quote, "Those who survived always narrated their struggles to me growing up," end quote. And that example, I just felt, highlights the influence and impact of oration and storytelling through generations as a linguistic vessel to capture and communicate history in such a significant and familiar way. Thank you to Dr. Linda Ritchie as well for starting off by noting what happens in the classroom is not what happens outside of the classroom. And although you were talking about the context of South Africa, it felt like a very relatable access point for myself, and I'm sure other colleagues and students outside of South Africa as well, and speaks to, I felt, the heart of the decolonial subversion special issue. And thank you for sharing your aims, the methodology and the results of your group work. It was really interesting that whilst the experiment provided an opportunity to express and share across languages for students, and thereby creating a learning environment which welcomes the plurality of languages and becomes more inclusive in that way, there was still that continuation of power dynamics at play, which came out of, you know, which languages were chosen and, you know, for when and for which characters as well. And I thought it was really exciting and bold to purposely leave the experimental pedagogy deliberately open-ended, giving students that space to engage with the activity without a restrictive steer. And in your paper, which is also included in the special issue, you further comment on the limitation of trans languaging and how this can be, quote, treated as a resource for exchange, then cultural significance, end quote, which for me caused me to wonder how institutions, whether these be secondary or higher education institutions, how they can help through possible channels such as staff development, policy and or practice to ensure that cultural significance is recognised in this work and is very much valued. Thank you very much also to Dr. Shahina Parvin. It was powerful to hear your autobiographical account and the histories informing your personal experiences. A few themes which came to mind as you were speaking were that of language and education, language and employment, language and worldviews and dynamics. And I really appreciated the time taken to share the arguments on the connection between preserving English language as a way of also preserving Anglo-Canadian culture and status, and how that foundation then leads to considerations around assimilation as well. And transferring those points to the context of a university classroom made me question, how do we recognise languages among our students in the classroom? And how are we trying to understand how assimilation may be currently experienced and or challenged as well? And your reflections on experiences of the English language testing system, the IELTS process and the writing centre spoke to how these types of interactions can often feel siloed and disconnected, not only calling for a review of how these are supported and framed, but also how these pieces are connected together institutionally. And within your paper, a particular statement that stood out to me was when you say on page 72, quote, "I felt I did not belong in the education system," end quote. And for me, that question speaks also to the wider considerations of the special issue around how do we value languages. Finally, just to comment and extend on sort of speakers' general points and also Victoria's reflections, I feel as though the languages we hold within and across staff and student communities play a really core role in who we are, and that's been commented on by other speakers as well. And increasing visibility of language use, multilingualism, different forms of communications are not only important but vital if we are to meaningfully contribute to enhancing students' belonging and their sense of community within university. And what the wonderful speakers and this special issue underlines is how through interrogating language and through interrogating forms of communication, we can also simultaneously provide channels for deconstruction, reflection, reframing, challenge, contextualization, and also change. I'll pause there. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thank you, Danielle. Very clear, very, very insightful. And finally, well, third speaker, third reflection now from Dr. Damien Fitzpatrick, who is an English language tutor working, I think, between the Language Centre and London College of Fashion. Damien, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks for the invitation. It's been a fantastic session. It's been really, really almost humbling. I was like, oh yeah, there's so many different things are running through my head that I think I need to incorporate this, or that's something I should be doing, or that's something I can develop more. It was really, really thought-provoking. And as I said, I'm trying to incorporate some of these ideas already into my own teaching practices. I'm also going to be sharing these stories with colleagues and also with students, because I think that's really interesting as well when they hear the kind of stories that are being told from different perspectives in different contexts as well, how languages can be used to help them do the things that they want to do. And I think that's one of the main things that we try to get across in our language sessions. So I work with departments very closely. I work in the London College of Fashion. And so we see students on a regular basis, but I'm working with course teams, people working in studios, as well as the students. And we're trying to build up this kind of knowledge base of what language is and what it can do for the students to do the things that they want to do. So what I'm going to try and do is I really just go through the 4 speakers again. I really like the first one, Noor. This idea of comedy, I just thought it was great. This idea, a completely different kind of genre that kind of flipped expectations. And it got me thinking about who are our students, particularly with this idea of autoethnography. And how can we, or more importantly, how can I help the students show their multiple selves, which I thought was a really interesting kind of phrase, through the different languages available to them. It reminded me of a student in a different institution many years ago who basically just said, look, I can't be me in the class. I am never me. I can only do what the language allows me to do. When I'm back home in my home country speaking my other language, I am this kind of person, that kind of person. And I often wonder, am I missing that in my own language classes in the kind of way I'm teaching or helping the students learn to do the things that they want to do? Linda's one, the translanguaging one, was really interesting. I just, it's been great. How can I give more voice to the different languages in my own classes? I think I'm trying to create spaces at the moment, but I'm not doing enough, I don't think. But I'm trying to allow for time for students to work with those languages, to use translation, to have space, to kind of discuss what different kind of concepts mean in different languages. We've recently had a couple of discussions around key terms where students have actually spent time in the classroom looking up these words and explaining them to other people. And I had a monolingual student from here saying, I never knew that. I never thought of it that way before. So I think this idea of kind of knowledge building through multiple languages is also, I think, really quite interesting. Shahina, this was, I mean, it really struck with me because, again, it kind of reminded me of many of my students, this idea of it being intimidating for many students, and linking this idea of language and just not being able to kind of do the things or be the person that you want to be, I think is really tough for those students. And I think it was a real reminder for me as well to go back in and say, right, how can we kind of help those students explore and explain a little bit more about who they are and what they want to do? This idea of mimicking the dominant culture. I think one thing that we try to do in our language classes is kind of open up to kind of make language a little bit more visible. We want students to kind of have a look at how language is being created, so then maybe they could take a more critical stance on it. So these are, I thought they were absolutely fantastic. And it kind of almost made me really emotional, this how to help students not self-blame. And that I think is really important. How can we do that a little bit more in that kind of language class? I agree with both Constant and Danielle, this idea of what is language. And I think the one thing for me, I especially agree with Constant with this idea of what does it do? And I think we're trying to get this across with our students, but also we've started to do a couple of projects with staff where we've set up little discussions and talks under the kind of banner of what do we mean when we talk about language. And we've got lots of people coming in, including, thank you to Victoria, to Constant, and to lots of others talking about these different ideas. We've had sessions on translanguaging and coloniality of language. And there's been a real discussion amongst the staff about, okay, I never knew that. How about this? Where can I find out more about the other? So that kind of space for discussing what language is and what it does at the university, I think is really important. So hopefully we can build on this a little bit more. But really, this was I absolutely loved it today. It was really great. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Damien. That's great. Thank you so much. And our final discussant and reflector is Hyunju Chu, a postdoctoral researcher from Central St. Martin's. I first learnt about Hyunju Chu's work through some really interesting talks and presentations called Translation Cases, and you may touch on that, but I would like to offer you the floor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Victoria, for the introduction. Yes, I am Hyunju. I'm a PhD candidate at Central St. Martin's, UAL, and as Victoria briefly mentioned, I initiated the postgraduate interest group called Translation Cases back in 2022 to really explore. It was out of my personal interest in how translation helps decentralizing the knowledge production in English-speaking higher education environments. And just a brief background about myself, I am an international researcher from South Korea, and I consider myself bilingual between Korean, which is my mother tongue, and English. And I also speak some Japanese, Mandarin, and I'm currently trying to learn Spanish. And well, just to begin with my question really to Dr. Ritchie, because it was just fascinating to learn about the concept of translanguaging. I do have some previous experience with translation myself, and also, as I explained, the personal interest about translation. But I found the new it was for me the first time really reading about this concept of translanguaging, and I hope you have time later to maybe expand a little bit about you know how translanguaging is different from translation, or how they work hand in hand towards this idea of decolonization. So I'll be looking forward to that. And I think I have three main points of reflection. And the first one is quite personal. The special issue really made me look back on my compartmentalization, I would say, of uses of language, and how I found my different use of tongues very situational. And just to go back to my personal background a little bit, I've been in English-speaking environments for education since I was 15 years old. I was first in the US, then I went to Japan to attend a master's program taught in English. And now I've been in the UK for the current PhD program for 3 years. And the more I became fluent in English and eloquent in having academic dialogues in English, the less comfortable I became in having similar conversations in Korean, which is supposedly my mother tongue. And now I feel like English is more appropriate for having professional conversations as a researcher, while Korean is really reserved for having personal conversations with family and friends. And I think this shows how under the current system, studies in English-speaking higher education environments really, it sort of is asked to be facilitated by creating a linguistic other within oneself. And I completely agree with Dr. Kanakaraja and his point in conversation with the editors that, I quote, "It is important to combine the concern about the medium of knowledge construction and dissemination with considerations relating to ontology and epistemology of the researcher, and that we must think of all languages as being equally legitimate resources for knowledge making," end quote. And my second point of reflection is actually about the current, it's more about the system that still reinforces the dominance of English. And I had a meeting last week with Joe and Helen from, I'm not sure if they're here today, but they work for the UAL Language Center. And they are currently working on releasing an official guideline for both staff and students at UAL on the use of machine translation tools to participate in class, read academic texts, and write essays, etc. And during our discussion, there were other participants from the staff side as well. And it turned out to be the matter of allowing the use of machine translation tools is a very tricky issue, because although the tool is very helpful for closing the gap in academic competence between native English speakers and non-native speakers, it still needs to be regulated to ensure that the students actually learn English, and also to prevent academic misconduct such as plagiarism. But during the discussion, it was revealed that many people agreed that it would be more beneficial for the students to actually learn English. And I just found this very ironic because UAL is an educational institution, for the sake of education, we're actually trying to take away the tool that is meant to really democratize access to knowledge, to go beyond the linguistic barriers. And I actually saw this as UAL implicitly siding with the idea of empowerment that Dr. Shahina Parvin mentioned in the paper. I quote, "The West has produced itself as superior while naturalizing its colonial power as beneficial for colonized people, leading them to alter their cognitive thinking and their ways of living to match Western norms and structures. The colonial power of the English language is not an exception, and it has been presented to colonized people in the form of their empowerment." So by telling the students that having a command of English is the correct way of learning, UAL is actually perpetuating the colonial system of knowledge production, which is quite ironical. And the third point is actually a reflection on my own research methodology. And I actually felt encouraged after this reflection. So just to briefly explain what my current research is at UAL, I'm studying how artistic practice, which involves immaterial facets such as process, artists' labor, and contextual meanings, and how it can be translated into concrete objects. And I'm focusing on the case of contemporary artists' books, which are artistic publications produced autonomously by artists as their practice or as an extension of their practice. And I am incorporating the method of object biography, which is traditionally used in anthropology, archaeology, and museum studies to factually track and catalog an artifact's life trajectory. And I've taken the liberty of the researcher to really creatively interpret this methodology by taking its meaning literally and actually writing a creative essay-esque biography of contemporary artist books to really present these objects in real multicultural situations of production and circulation. And this reminded me, not reminded me, well, the paper reminded me of my methodology when Dr. Nu Sule's paper talked about the creative nonfiction, which she explains as creative format in which stories about the self and others are collected and shared. And by doing this in my own research, by interpreting a traditional methodology and giving a slight creative twist, I'm able to stage artist books within their contemporary context, which is now much more globalized and localized, hence glocalized, than how they have been seen traditionally in the academia. Traditionally, the artist books, like many other subjects of the arts, were explored within the Western arena, and they are considered to have been born during the avant-garde of the early 20th century, met their height during the neo-avant-garde period between 1950s and 60s in North America and Western Europe. And I wanted to, through this methodological interpretation, I wanted to expand the horizon of imagination, as Dr. Sule says, by incorporating the real, diverse perspectives on the subject matter. And I, as a result, interviewed participants from 8 cities in Asia, Europe, North America, and South America, and weaved their accounts with my own autoethnographic accounts of the experience of artist books. And I weaved them into one strand of narrative to achieve a multicultural, translingual, and possibly global idea of contemporary artist books. So reading the special issue really encouraged me to continue pursuing this route of knowledge production. And I would like to end my part by congratulating all of you again on the publication of the special issue. And it was an honor to take place here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hyunju. It's really, really interesting to hear your perspectives. I think particularly around the new area of machine translation, amongst other areas. Linda, I wondered if you wanted to or were able to respond to Hyunju's question around translanguaging.
Thank you. Yes, it's such a great question.
Maybe
and
I'll just stay visible. I don't know. Yeah.
So you really did make me think when you raised it, just how best to explain it. So I think there are definitely ways in which translanguaging and translating overlap. Both of them are moving between one language and another. I think the easiest way to explain translanguaging is it is a concept that is specifically designed for the educational space. So the idea of it came to be used in the classroom to utilize all learners' languages. There's two types of translanguaging. So there's spontaneous, where you allow your students, if possible, so its origins were a study between English and Welsh speakers, and they could speak both, and they would kind of mix it and kind of accessing the linguistic resources of the learners to help them learn English. So translanguaging is different to translating in the idea that it's specifically for educational purposes. So it's either deliberately implemented by the educator with the hope that the learners will, eventually become comfortable and moved automatically and naturally between languages. I think a lot of its origins come in the idea that, particularly with the world in which we live now, language boundaries are just so fluid. And many speakers, you'll know, speak multiple languages and naturally move between them. So it's almost an idea of, in an educational space, accessing what learners do naturally, allowing it in the classroom, foregrounding languages that have previously been silenced, and allowing learners to pull on those languages to make sense. Because a lot of the findings are that when learners can speak in their own language, they can explore something in greater depth. They've got the vocabulary and the nuance of expression. There's obviously issues with translanguaging, definitely. So that this is not the forum, but it's a specifically educational thing. I don't know if that helps make the difference between translanguaging and translating clearer.
It definitely does. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And we're at the time in our event webinar today where we can take further questions. If you have any questions that you would like to post in the Q&A section, or perhaps questions in the chat. While you're formulating your question, I mean, I think translanguaging is a fascinating concept, and I would add to Linda's response, very comprehensive response, that I think translanguaging is a tool for, or a way of thinking about languages where boundaries are, as Linda said, are fluid and dynamic. So I'm just going to check the chat to see if we have any additional questions. Thank you. A nice comment from Romina, who is one of the editors in chief for Decolonial Subversions. And perhaps I would invite any further questions or responses.
Victoria, may I come in here?
Yes, please do.
Just having a look at Chrissy DaCosta's question that's come through about how we get universities to really, stop this favoring of the one language, because you're quite right. There is a divide between what looks right in practice, what we know should happen, and then what really does. And my experience from working in a secondary school and for some time in a tertiary place is, until, unfortunately, we change our assessments, we will never get people to buy in really encouraging the use of multiple languages, multiple cultures, different interpretations. So I'll give an example from my educational space. The sort of senior certificate at the school for Shakespeare still asks traditional questions on plot and character and theme. And I believe that until the examining bodies change that and ask questions that allow learners to draw on their knowledge of the text, but read the text from their own cultural perspectives, provide their own voices, teachers will never change that. And when the teachers are still teaching to the exams, to the assessments, and until the assessments shift to incorporate multiple languages and multiple cultures, and I'm still thinking about the how to do the multiple languages idea, the multiple cultural interpretations is easier. We're never going to actually be able to empower, particularly those of us in the global south who are working with languages that are not English and the main languages there. I don't know if that helps a little bit. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Linda. I've noticed that Romina Istrati had their hand up. Romina, are you there?
Hello, Victoria. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, I just realized that I could turn my camera. I don't know if I'm allowed to turn the camera off, but anyways, it's lovely to hear you all and be with you. And thank you so much, Victoria, for organizing this. I apologize that we weren't much of a support here. This is, really humbling to learn from you and see how you coordinated this volume. So thank you so much. It's been a truly educational experience for us as well, both as editors-in-chief, and I think here I could probably speak on behalf of Monica too, but if Monica is also present, Monica, feel free to jump in. We really learn from you, and our aim establishing decolonial subversions was, precisely to I think a speaker sort of referred to that, to overcome the split within us, where we speak multiple languages and we have multiple cultural backgrounds and we exist in multiple contexts, but yet we cannot embrace that multiplicity within academia. So it was really an existential crisis and problem that we sought to resolve already as PhD students within Western institutions. So we're very much engaged in this conversation that you're having today, Victoria, and I guess my question really comes from that place. What lessons or challenges or sort of key points you and Gillian took away coordinating this amazing volume that you could share with us to take forward as editors-in-chief to apply to decolonial subversions and what we do, but also for journals that are currently monolingual and are, part of the standard system. What sort of steps could we take as editors in this particular position, to become more inclusive and to embrace that multiplicity? Any thoughts? I know this is, is not a resolvable, it's an unresolvable issue rather. But, if you have any thoughts or takeaways, we're here to learn and adapt our model and how we do things. So thank you so much, and apologies for the long-winded question.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I would say that perhaps to respond in two ways. I think, first of all, as academics who have worked in Britain and UK higher education, mostly but not exclusively in the southeast of England, that certainly my lived experience is limiting, and therefore working with scholars in diverse contexts, such as Linda Ritchie, who we've heard from, but also from Maria Sintra Martins in Brazil. I think there was a sense that whatever knowledge or expertise or lived experiences that we brought as academics, as teachers, as researchers, that was necessarily limiting. And at certain points in the editorial process, and in particular the peer review process, there was a need to reflect quite deeply on our ability and our rights to reflect and respond to scripts and drafts. On the one hand, there was a sense that we were working together as a group, almost as a collective in a sense, with you and with Monica and with all the contributors, but that also there was a need to produce a coherent special issue. But at the same time, we did not have the lived experience or the knowledge of what it was like, for example, to work with Indigenous students in a university in Brazil on their academic literacies and translation work. So there was a sense that working globally, working transnationally, working transdisciplinarily was quite challenging. We certainly learned a lot, but weren't sure that we were equipped. And I think that's perhaps quite important for the decentering and rethinking how how to do academic knowledge production, as it were. And then I think secondly, your question perhaps reminds me of the need for resources. So resources for scholars from the global south, or from the global south in the global north, from marginalized communities to become involved in higher education, in academic text production. I think there's an issue of resources. We've talked about translanguaging, but I think there's also a need for kind of material, physical resources, not only machine translation to support the work of those who perhaps hadn't considered but would like to publish in English, but also in languages other than English that are not sufficiently represented in academic publication currently. So thank you for your question. I can see that Constant has his hand up.
Thank you, Victoria. I just wanted to follow up on Linda's point about assessment being a very important aspect of driving change. And unless you change assessment, there's always, a bigger battle, because that's a kind of roadblock. I think that's undoubtedly true, but particularly in relation to summative assessment. So, for example, until universities, English-speaking universities, stop using IELTS and TOEFL and so on as one of the gatekeeping exercises, then English will likely to remain a very powerful, as it were, language for quite a long time to come, particularly in places where English is the medium of instruction. However, it is not impossible to imagine that assessment for learning, in other words, formative assessment, can be carried out by teachers when they do, if you like, less formal and not summative assessment. In other words, as teachers ask students to produce assignments in order to find out whether they have learned something as part of the teaching, then that kind of assessment is not subject to the same amount of control. And there, multilingualism or translanguaging can come in much more, as it were, kind of productively, because you're not fighting a big battle against, if you like, the authorities and the power structure. And if the educational justification of using any linguistic means available to express meaning, then there's very little argument anybody can mount against that kind of multilingual or translingual usage. I think that's probably something that that can be, if you like, the starting point for quite a lot of localized initiatives, and I think that remains the hope anyway. Now, one other little point, and that is, it is not the case that everything is completely kind of immovable. One example is Trinity College London. This is the kind of English language test provider. It's a company that runs English language tests. And it also offers some teach education programs in TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages. For one of their diploma programs, part of the assessment is actually open to translingual texts. So in other words, students from different language backgrounds going through one of their training programs can produce their certain written assignments, or the sort of assessment piece, if you like, using a variety of languages in the expression of their content meaning. And so this is actually a living example now, possibly on a relatively small scale, but it is now beginning to penetrate some of the summative assessment regimes So anyway, I thought that might be something that I should report.
Thank you, Constant. We have 4 minutes left, incredibly, and there are 2 questions that I'm not sure we're going to have time for. What I would like to do is read Karen's question, but perhaps not respond to it. Karen Watts has said, does anyone have any thoughts on the advent of the SQE regime, and in particular the move to single best answer questions, and whether it goes against what Linda is saying? There does not seem to be any linguistic freedom. So perhaps these are, that's another follow-on question relating to assessment practices. I think we will have to begin to end today's wonderful celebration of the Decolonial Subversion's publication. It's been wonderful to hear and to see so many speakers and discussants reflect and their reflections. I would finally like to thank the Decolonising Arts Institute at UIL, and in particular Professor Susan Puisan-Locke's support for the project and for many projects and for the work, and also to Professor Gargi Bhattacharyya for her reflections and for opening the event. And finally, I would like to thank Nora. Can you come on camera, please, if that's possible? Nora Kumar, who many of you will have heard from, for putting the event together and for working many, many hours undoing the technical conundrums that we have encountered. So thank you, Nora, so much. You won't believe it, but this is Nora's first public event that she has managed, run, organized, developed and executed for us, and has done a fantastic job. So thank you to everybody who has joined us today. It's been a real privilege. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.